Morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Kevin and the team and my co-panelists for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. I am not going to be quite as research innovative as the previous speaker, but I will give you some perspectives from the Caribbean and the work that we do and how we see some of these issues emerging. Definitely for us, we sit in the midst of this very tricky issue for many reasons because of our natural, no pun intended, location. And because we sit at a very important confluence between Europe and Africa, and actually the way that our, exposure to disasters usually works is that we are affected by anything that comes off the coast of Cape Verde, et cetera, that part of the world. And that's usually when we get our alert to look up and to be a little bit more pay a little bit more attention. We sit very much in the midst of this issue, not just from an individual or even a community point of view, but also from a country-based point of view. So some of what I will be talking about is how these issues that we're talking about actually percolate up when you're in a small island developing state at the national level. So they percolate from the bottom up, and then they also percolate from the bottom down in terms of how you manage disasters and their impacts and how you change the way you prepare. So bear with me. I'll try to make sure that I keep to time. So, when thinking about this, and it was great that I think Jason mentioned this whole issue of terminology, because it is very true that a lot of what happens in terms of how we see these issues, our response to them is very much about terminology. And I think most of us would have seen a lot of the discussion that would have happened around global warming as a topic, and how that became a very kind of almost heavily political issue, and now we've been trying to change the context to climate change because the understanding of global warming and the way that those words were interpreted, anything that was not warming, became proof that, climate change itself was also not an issue or was natural in a way. But when we're talking about these issues, particularly for us in the Caribbean, these words matter and they matter very significantly. And even for us, generally, we go beyond climate change because for us, the issue is the variability before you even get to the change. Because of our size, because of the issues we're dealing with, variability, unexpected events that could be both intense and extensive, that could be sudden and slow onset are challenges for us to be able to cope. And they're challenges for persons within our society to be able to cope with them when there is limited information. There are not systems in place. Early warning systems don't necessarily cope very well with the unexpected. And, we also have persons who are literally living on the edge. So they're living from paycheck to paycheck, or they're living on very limited incomes. This includes both men and women, particularly if you look at fisheries or agriculture, where often we tend to see these issues in greater detail and with greater nuance, and really understanding how the unnaturalness and the natural features of disasters and hazards really come into play in terms of the vulnerability, the susceptibility, and ultimately the vulnerability that people experience. So for us, the two words that we tend to use very much are climate change, where we're looking at increased, changes within climate patterns. Those could include weather patterns, and also the fact that this increases our disaster risk in a variety of ways and affects vulnerability to hazards and is changing exposure patterns. This is also important because in many cases, we are very coastal. A lot of our populations live on the coastline, usually like 60 to 80%. And also a lot of the services which you rely on enable to prepare and respond to an event are also on that coastline. And so for us, there are some natural elements in a strange sense, because it's just the way things are, even though the reason for them is not necessarily logical or necessarily had to be this way. And similarly, disaster risk for us also is something that we see intertwined with climate variability and change. And because we also see that there are cascading effects that can come from a lack of proper preparation, a lack of information, et cetera, that mean that what may even seem to be a simple event, such as intense rain for 2 or 3 hours, can actually turn into something that is problematic and a disaster. So I will go on to the next slide. When we talk about this, and I look at, as again, I look at this through the lens of the Caribbean, we look and we are continuing to examine natural processes versus disasters. Whether an event is a disaster or not depends ultimately sometimes on location and also who's affected, how badly, and for how long. It definitely, as I noted, is about our preparedness. And one of the issues that we are challenged with often is understanding what preparedness means, understanding that preparedness is not a guarantee that something is going to happen. So one of the things that happens sometimes in this region of mine is that, the Met Department will say, we need to prepare, something's coming, and people rush out, they rush out to buy things, they rush out to prepare. When it doesn't come, then they suddenly are upset, and they are, not sure how come, the predictions were not on point, and they're concerned that they would have spent money for something that did not occur. I can see both sides of that issue, particularly if you're living on the edge or even below the edge, in terms of with very limited resources and relying on this information to be able to make decisions about how to allocate your financial and human and other resources to be able to cope with what could happen. These are some issues that we're definitely facing, and we continue to face in terms of how to mediate between the issue of preparedness and risk management generally, and then the issue of responding to an event that turns out to be a hazard, a significant hazard, or as you would say, a disaster. And so these are also some of the tensions that we're seeing in very practical terms, and you see increasing, emphasis on communication, and really trying to explain what is happening and what information we have, what can be guaranteed and what cannot be guaranteed. And pressing the point that given our vulnerability, given the issues that we've seen before, that we need to take the risk of over preparing in the event that something does happen. We don't want to be caught unprepared. And I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about, 1 hour Hurricane Elsa in 2021, and the kind of impact that had on Barbados, where I'm based. In terms of the differing responses to disaster, what I think we can say, not just from our perspective, but if we look out from ourselves to the world, is that despite the mounting evidence, it does seem that we've turned a corner in the sense that I think these issues were always sensitive and they were always political, but there is now even greater heightened political context around these issues, and to the sense where it's not just politically social, but it is also politically political, if you get what I mean, that you now see very clear lines being separating different parties in terms of whether they believe or don't believe in climate change and its naturalness, and therefore how that infuses a whole ideology about how society should react, should plan, should invest, or should not invest. The issue for SIDS, and I would think also for most persons on the front line, no matter where they are, is that the responsibility for causing the dynamics that we're seeing, both the natural and unnatural parts of it. We can't deny the fact that there's a natural system, but the fact is that the evidence suggests that we have had a huge impact on the natural system, and that system is no longer as natural as it might have been in the past. And that the responsibility of this and the consequent responsibility for response is definitely not equal. And so what we see now is a tension between your power and influence to even make sure the issues on the agenda, to make sure that money, finance, and investment is allocated in order for you then at the lower end of the scale, if you're an individual or a household or community, to be able to do what you can to respond to this phenomenon. The naturalness has become an ideological camouflage as well in some cases for the social dimensions of disasters, because we often do not want to look at how inequalities within society, both historical and situational, have made this situation, several times worse than it might have been otherwise. But in order to avoid the investments, the accountabilities perhaps that will be required, we point to the naturalness of the disaster, and therefore using words like, force majeure, that, and things that we cannot, change acts of God. All of these kinds of terminologies come up as ways to explain how it's not possible for even the state or those who have been endowed with the capacity to respond, to be able to respond and to do something. And if it's not adequate, to be held accountable for that lack of adequacy. What we also know in the broader political realm at the international level is that those who have historically contributed more to the actions and investments that would have led to what we're seeing today, often can sometimes be using this ideology to shirk responsibility, or to then talk about how it needs to be shared, which is true. But if we look at the lingua franca within the discussions globally, we also recognize that there may be common, but there are also differentiated responsibilities and capacities to respond. And what we've seen in some ways, if I look at this as a social scientist, is that in some ways, the way that we have taken to dealing with issues socially within society, and even things like crime, where we tend to put a lot of the focus on those we can find, we can arrest, and in other words, the low-hanging fruit. And we tend to, see difficulties and be much slower and less aggressive at dealing with those who have power and influence. We tend to also take the same approach to this particular issue. And I think this is also leading, sorry?
1 minute 30 remaining, Leisa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is also leading to some of the complications that we're seeing in terms of our ability to respond. And so very quickly, for us in the Caribbean particularly, we cannot separate some of these issues from colonization, having been colonies ourselves, and some of the systems that are in place that we're trying to change are ones that we would have had very little influence on. In some ways, we've inherited them. We've also inherited relationships that we're also trying to navigate now as independent countries, and where we're seeing the impacts of disasters and climate variability and change. Gender inequalities and disparities, which is one of the areas which we work in a lot, are also inherited and baked in. And so we find ourselves often in a confluence of dealing with, as I said, macro level issues, meso level issues, and micro level issues, all showing similar patterns of baked in inheritance, and also difficulties in actually shifting and changing the power dynamics that would allow for us to be proactive in our response. As our Prime Minister has noted, we've been carrying the cost of climate change for a while now. We're carrying the cost of the G7 industrialized countries on our balance sheets, and it's wrong, and nobody's making room to ensure we get access to grants. We can't borrow if we have no fiscal space, and the cost of borrowing is also prohibitive. I think that quote captures very nicely, and unfortunately, all of the broad parameters that make it very difficult to even be proactive and responsive, even though that within a broader context, there is definitely a lot of arguments for not being on the front lines. Of course, when you're responsible for persons and beneficiaries and the public, you do need to act. And these are some of the constraints that we're facing. In some ways, it will be interesting to see what happens with Barbados now in its context as a republic, and also how the discussion on climate change impacts and the needs for reparations and reparatory justice will conflate. As I said, one of the things that I think brings this into stark relief is that we had last year our first hurricane in 65 years. It was a hurricane for literally an hour, but the devastation it wrought on our housing was quite significant. And I thought it is a pointed lesson to us that even small scale events, or seeming small scale events, can actually have outsized impacts. Just quickly to just say that part of this is then shaping a shifting conversation, in some cases that moves forward and in others that moves backwards, in which we're talking about impacts that are not just us, but broader and infecting those who would also be the ones we'd be looking for to provide the finance. We see expanding climate and environmental justice conversations in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And more we see this language as we present our case at the international level. We see a more systematic attention to gender and intersectional lenses, because we realize that it's through that lens we understand the dynamics and the nuances of how these issues are impacting the lives of persons and their ability to either spontaneously respond or to plan a response and to actually build up resilience in a critical way. That is also leading to an increasing rejection of the naturalness of some of these disasters and the need to push forward in the context of a more just and equal response, and to ensure that not just finance, but information, technology, knowledge is also being used effectively to respond to the issue.